I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
There's perhaps no more controversial person in the 20th century American history than Malcolm X. Depending on who you ask, the man who was born Malcolm Little and later called himself El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz was either a dangerous radical or a visionary campaigner for justice. 62 years after his death, the debate rages on. But who was the real Malcolm X? And what is his legacy today on what would be his 92nd birthday? Joining me now is Dr. Jared A. Ball, Associate Professor of Communication Studies at Morgan State University and co-editor with Dr. Todd Stephen Burrows of A Life of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. Dr. Ball, welcome.
It's a pleasure.
It's great having you
here. Let me just say off
us.
the top, it's a lie of reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X, which is a critique of his book, which is A Life of Reinvention.
Oh, okay.
So just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you.
No
Thank you
problem,
very much. I appreciate that. So who was Malcolm X? I mean, why was he so consequential, and how would you describe his worldview?
Well, for me and many others, we argue that Malcolm was one of the greatest modern-day exemplars of radical philosophy, organizing, and with an ability to move masses of people to further themselves in organized radical activity. And one of the reasons why he remains so important, not only because of the work during his life, but because of the symbol that he continues to represent. Along those lines of encouraging a variety of isms that this society doesn't welcome, including nationalism, Pan-Africanism, socialism, anti-imperialism. These are some of the ideas with which he was working that he represented as well as anyone the world has ever produced, and continues to be a symbol for, which is why, as you said in your intro, he remains such a controversial figure, because there has to be something done with that symbol, even posthumously.
Yeah. And it seems like there's always somebody trying to grab a hold of it. I mean, we've seen the Disneyfication of Dr. King, for example.
Sure.
And, the complete airbrushing out of the very strong radical positions that he took against the war in favor of poor people, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a tragedy. And it seems that there's been a kind of a similar, only a more bifurcated, one-dimensional portrayal of Malcolm X as well, at least in a lot of venues.
Well, I mean, we still live in a society that is bent on white supremacy, on capitalism, on inequality, that is intended and purposeful. And Malcolm represented a strong and militant response to that, dealing first with his own Black American, African American, or as he said, Africans in America community. But then began to expand that and internationalize that and challenge U.S. foreign policy as part of the process of organizing even his own community. So in his life, he was a threat not only to the powers that be here and around the world, but as that threat required that they prop up other versions of activism. They promoted for a time, they tried to play for a time Dr. King off of Malcolm X. And then once Malcolm was assassinated and King himself became more radical along those similar lines, he himself had to be dealt with in a similar way. To this day, there has been an attempt, and as one of the arguments that we try to wage in critique of the last work attributed to Manning Marable, is that there's an attempt to posthumously reinvent the assault on him and his image and his brand. So symbolically, Malcolm to this day represents, for a lot of different people, what strength of man and womanhood is, what Islam is, or what Islam should be for Muslims. He represents what Black national radical organizing should represent. And he represents a standard of politics that has to be assaulted so that a new form in this world could take hold and be seen as acceptable. In other words, one of the points that we raise, for instance, is that there could be no Barack Obama, the neoliberal, Wall Street friendly Black first president, had there not been first the assassination physically of Malcolm X and then posthumously of his brand and his symbol. You have to, and this was even expressed in the pages of the counterintelligence program operation created by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to not only attack Malcolm specifically, but to destroy for young Black people broadly the idea that this kind of militant organization was something that they should aspire to. And I think we're seeing today the struggles, even decades later, of Black and other communities trying to find, well, how best can we organize and deal with these problems? Because every material condition that Malcolm was alive to struggle against in his death has gotten worse.
Yeah, yeah.
So
there's it was an observation by Peter Farb, an anthropologist back in the 60s, who looked at Native American cultures at first contact and compiled a brilliant book about them, that the storyline, which is never explicitly said, of Europeans who came to this continent, first with regard to Native Americans and then with regard to African slaves who were brought here, people who were brought here as slaves, was we will welcome you to our culture. You just must become like us. Sure. This was the iron fist with the velvet glove over it, right? The velvet glove was the we will welcome you. And this, and in many Native American communities, people are reclaiming their memory, their language, and yet those memories, those languages, those religions, those customs of the people who were dragged over here in the 16, 17, 1800s have been ripped in ways that even Native Americans haven't experienced. How did Malcolm speak to that? From what I remember from having read his autobiography 30 years ago, it seems, in your mind, and how are African Americans speaking to that? If that's even necessary now, or am I just totally out there?
Oh no, obviously it's still necessary because, as I said, the process that began with enslavement in that interruptive moment for African development and history manifested in this country in such a way that, as you said, there was an attempt to dislocate people from their traditions to make it more easy, in the parlance of the general that put it together and was greatly written about by Ward Churchill, to kill the Indian and save the man. That is, get rid of traditions that would impede the so-called progress of manifest destiny, to make it easier for people to become more malleable and positioned in ways that their exploitation would be more easily carried out. So for the African experience here, that process not only began and is still ongoing, but requires a constant rebuilding and reshaping, which is, again, one of the reasons why Malcolm in his life was such a threat, and in his death remains even perhaps more of a threat, since he's not around to defend himself or speak for himself. And then you're left with people like me, who I just, as a joke, had to make fun of the teaser you had coming in, saying that I'm one of the leading Malcolm X scholars in the world, which is unfortunately laughable, and I don't want to let you or your show's credibility go down, in the sense that there are many other great folks who have done a lot of important work on Malcolm. But one of the things that Malcolm was attempting to do, and one of the reasons why he remained such an important symbol, was that he was trying to say, and he said very clearly, we were victims of the United States. We are an African population. We must interpret our existence here not as a process of United States expanding democracy and freedom, but as the United States colonizing us at the same time they were colonizing Africans on the continent itself. So it's all part of the same process, albeit in a different location with slight variations applied to those specific locations. So Malcolm was saying, you need to understand as a Black American that your history didn't start with the advent of the United States, that there is a much longer and deeper African past to which you are connected historically and culturally. But politically, more importantly, in a very radical Pan-African way, he was saying that understanding has to be connected to a political movement to address the lived and material experiences of this moment. And that's why he was so insistent on speaking to our man and womanhood in this time, in this moment, right now. We don't want some freedom in the future. We want it in this exact moment. And one of the ways that he sought to address that was by reminding Black people that you are not isolated from the world. And in fact, one of the struggles we see happening right now is that Black people have to look outside of the United States for support and for development and for allies, because here there is too little of it. And the federal government and its current arrangement and politics as they are in this country, even now, much less in his time, are not open to the kind of radical changes that we have to have. So we can't just, it's not enough to just say we have to appeal to the United States. We have to make appeals to the broader world and recognize that our destinies are wrapped up with those communities in other parts of the world.
Yeah, white supremacy here is alive and well.
Absolutely.
It absolutely is. So what do you see going forward as a consequence of Malcolm's life? The work that you're, the book that you wrote. We have about 2 minutes here.
Sure.
Just, well, that's...
Well, the great former political prisoner and Black Panther Party member Dhoruba bin Wahad has made this point over and over again, and I fully agree, that the assassination of Malcolm X has to be understood as part of a process of driving the conversation in our communities farther to the right, so that when we deal with all of the problems that are facing us now, we don't have that deep reservoir of brilliant analysis, radical analysis to tap back into. And we're left with the Democratic Republican Party sort of range of discussion and ideas, which are extremely limited, narrow, and don't lead to the solutions that we need to have. So going forward, we have to, and one of the reasons why we edited this book was that we wanted to be part of the argument that says we need to fight for and reclaim the ideas that Malcolm X was working with, and say that they are just as applicable now and just as relevant today as they have ever been, because as I said earlier, every material condition that Malcolm struggled against in his lifetime is worse today.
Yeah, and in the 30 seconds we have left, how might that be applied, for example?
Well, one example is that Black communities have to develop alternative electoral moves within that develop out of their own communities. There has to be a standard raised of radical Black nationalism and socialism and Pan-Africanism and anti-imperialism applied into the mix, and people have to get offline into rooms, in secure spaces where they can meet and grow and build organizations and then develop the movement that Malcolm himself was trying to develop in his lifetime. That's the best way I think we can commemorate him. Brilliant analysis. Jared Ball, thank you so much.
Pleasure,
thank you.
And now the big picture fact of the day. In yet another warning sign of the impending mass extinction, scientists now predict that 23 of California's 31 salmon species will disappear by the end of this century. And that's the way it is tonight. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Get out there, get active, tag You're It.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.